Trains and buses at a standstill, schools and businesses closed. Workers in France staged one of the biggest strikes in decades, furious at planned pension reforms. So are President Macron's proposals bold and necessary, or will they lead to his downfall? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Strikes and protests are common in France, but the biggest nationwide walkout in 24 years is posing a serious challenge to the president and his plans to overhaul the pension system. Public sector workers are threatening to strike until Christmas and beyond. 90% of rail services are cancelled, hundreds of flights are grounded, schools and tourist attractions are shut. President Emmanuel Macron says his reforms are long overdue, but people fear they'll be forced to work longer and get less money when they retire. Although polls show 7 out of 10 people want changes to the pension system, a similar number also support the strikes, with the strongest backing coming from young people. Natasha Butler has more from Paris.
Laurent Meiller's passionate about his job producing bread and pastries in his bakery outside Paris. But after working for more than 40 years, he's looking forward to retiring. He hopes the French government's plans to reform the pension system won't affect his future, and he understands why so many people oppose them.
The
ideal would be to find a system that's fair for everyone. It's a big ask. Some people were hired with certain benefits, and now they're being told those advantages could be taken away.
In France, the pension system's complicated. Each profession has a different scheme. Some people fear losing certain advantages or having their pensions reduced under the government's proposed reforms. Others say the system must be simplified.
I think pension systems need to be reformed. It's not acceptable that there are so many schemes. I think France has needed reforms for a while. They're not done because there's a lack of courage, and people take to the streets immediately.
Reforming the pension system was one of Emmanuel Macron's campaign promises. He says it needs to be streamlined to make it fairer and save public money. But past presidents have tried to reform it and failed. In 1995, President Jacques Chirac's government scrapped its reform plans after 3 weeks of nationwide strikes. In 2007, President Nicolas Sarkozy pushed through some changes, but not without public protest. Macron's plans face opposition from many sections of society, including transport workers who've threatened rolling strikes.
The ideal would be to find a system that's fair for everyone. It's a big ask. Some people were hired with certain benefits, and now they're being told those advantages could be taken away.
This analyst says the president faces his biggest test yet.
There's a risk that all the sectors join in. Health, transport, lawyers, university, then the government could fall. I don't think that we are at that point yet, but the government certainly can't back down, because it would be a political failure.
Macron has already passed several controversial reforms, and although he may feel confident after surviving months of yellow vest protests, social discontent still lingers. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Let's bring in our guests. Laura Slimani is a city councillor in Rouen. She was at one of the demonstrations and joins us by Skype. In London, Philippe Marliere, Professor of French and European Politics at University College London. Also by Skype from Saint-Malo, Jacques Roland, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute and Specialist in French Economic Policy. Welcome to all of you. Laura, why are people in France furious with the reforms of the retirement scheme that Macron wants to put into place?
Well, I think there's different factors to the fact that they are angry. But I was just in a demonstration this morning in Rouen, and it was massive. I've never seen this in my city. And I think a lot of old activists who are there said the same. So it's clearly a historic moment. And I think this is because This reform, first of all, is not very clear. So the government is not really saying what they want to do with the pensions. But some of the things they say are very, very worrying. One of them being that they want to move from the current system to a point system, which means that one day of work will be worth the same for everybody, which actually is not reassuring many people, because it will have consequences, like bigger consequences and bad consequences for people who have precarious jobs, people who work part-time, especially women, people who are experiencing a lot of joblessness. And we know that in France it is a big issue, especially in the popular areas, in the suburban areas. So I think this is one of the problems. The other one is that they say they want to cap the spending of the pension system to 14% of the GDP. And now, with if you consider the fact that the growth rates are not going to be big enough to compensate for the increase in the amount of people in pensions in the system in the next decades, then this means automatically that pensions will drop. So people know this, and this is why they're marching.
Philippe, I mean, here's the thing. You ask French people about the need to reform the pension scheme, and they would tell you, yes, we would like it to change. But then when it comes to this particular reform, they are very skeptical, they are concerned, they think that this is something that could affect their daily lives. Has President Macron failed in a way or another to explain his plan for the French people?
Well, I'm not quite sure that the French people were so keen on having any further change to the pension system. I think there have been several attempts, and I think one successful a few years ago to do that. And I think it's always been in the direction of making, making retiring age older with less benefits in the end. So I think people know that, and they are not only angry with the reform, because I think, as Laure just said, people will lose quite a lot on that. They will have to work from until the age of 64 as opposed to 62 right now to get full pension, and also they will earn less in return for that. So they are angry for that, rightly so, but also they feel that the reform altogether is not fair. Fairness is an important thing. That France is a very wealthy country in terms of GDP, and it seems that money is available. It's just the government, Macron, should think of redistributing that money in a better way and thinking of pensions first. Pensions are very important for people. Once you've worked all your life, you ought to retire at a sort of a relatively early age to benefit from the rest of your life and enjoy it. And I think it's a very important point, which is very often overlooked.
Jack, France is a wealthy nation, but however, economists will tell you that if the situation goes as it is now, there will be a deficit in the pension system in the near future. So therefore, it's about time to change the whole system.
Yes, France is a very wealthy country with a debt equivalent to 100% of its GDP. And one thing that put the cat among the pigeon in the lead up to the reform is the core report, this committee which is looking at the evolution of pensions, and which mentioned that by 2025 there would be a very big deficit, and some measures need to be taken urgently in order to balance the book by 2025, because 2025 is also the year in which the new scheme, the systemic reform, should take place. And the problem is that there's confusion. There are two reforms at the same time. One to balance the book urgently, and the other one is about the justification of changing, overhauling completely the French pension system. Funnily enough, 76% of the French people think that the system needs to be reformed. At the same time, 70% say they back the movement. And the reason why there is such anxiety is because this reform hasn't been clearly explained. The government hasn't managed to convince the people that it would be a reform which would make the system fairer and where most people would not lose. At the moment, people think they're buying a pig in a poke. They don't know exactly what's in it for them. And you have some professions who are rightly concerned about the future pensions, especially beyond the railway workers. You have the teachers whose pensions were based on the final 6 months, or public servants, based on the final 6 months of their career.
Compared to the
it will be
25 years
a points-based system. So
with the private
now
sector.
it will mean that it's all, they will take into account all the wages. That's why the government yesterday, trying to calm things down, announced that they would increase wages for teachers. But
that came too late. Laura, is this something that people are ready and willing to compromise on in the near future to move forward, or do you think this is a red line for the majority of the French people?
I think this is a red line because our pension system is also historically very important for French people. We shouldn't forget that this French social security system, including the pension system, is an inheritance of the Resistance National Council after the Second World War. It's a very, very strong social compromise in France. A lot of people lean on it. A lot of people count on it. So it's a very strong cultural thing. And I think the government is making a huge mistake in going forward with this reform. And we will ask for the reform to be taken away. And I just want to say one word about what Philippe Marliere touched upon earlier about the wealth distribution in society. I mean, the previous speaker said that we should balance the books. Yes, but then why is it always the responsibility of the same people to balance the books? Where is the contribution, the increased contribution of stakeholders, of big companies, shareholders of big companies whose revenues, whose income has skyrocketed over the past few years in France and all over the world? When do we stop dropping the contributions of company owners, of employers, which have continuously dropped over the past years into our social security system? I mean, the gap in the social security system is not the fault of people who work all their life. These people deserve fair pensions, and it's unfair that it's the same who pay the price for rich people to get richer.
Philippe, why is it difficult for the government to sell its proposal when it all comes out from the need to simplify things? So they're basically saying that France has 42 regimes and they would like to make it universal, simplified, one regime of pension for all the French people. This, in theory, should be, or in principle, should be a very good thing for the French people.
Well, in theory, I agree with you. To simplify a sort of rather complex pension system, 42 different regimes, you say, yes, into one, to merge it into one seems like a fantastic idea. The trouble is that at the end of it, people feel or are actually ripped off. Of course, it can't be seen as a good idea. So that's what people will be looking at precisely. And I think this is where Macron is, in my view, failing politically. If you look at the reaction amongst its own parliamentary group and amongst his own party, La France En Marche, I think you realize, La République En Marche, sorry, you realize that there's very little support. People are very lukewarm in his own party about this reform because they feel that deep down it is touching upon very sensitive matters. You know, as Laure said earlier, it's about the right for people to retire at sort of normal age, decent age, when you're not about to drop dead, and enjoy your retirement and also get the means to leave that retirement. And I think he's really upsetting that. And of course, it's also another point coming at the end of the line of a number of reforms which have all gone in the same direction, you know, taking from the sort of middle classes or working classes, asking them to make sort of the effort to balance the books. Whereas, you know, if he really wants to do that, balancing the books, probably should review the tax system in France, which is deeply unfair.
Jack, what kind of impact does the 42 regime have on the French economy?
That's very difficult to assert, but let's say the pension system the pension benefits accounts for 14% of the GDP, and the government would like to maintain that proportion. They would not like the cost of pension to increase beyond 14%. So that means that the economy should grow more. But there's one big problem with pensions. Like Laure mentioned, that it was created, everyone loves the French pension system, which is quite generous. But let's not forget that when it was created, there were 3.8 workers for one pensioner. Now we are in a situation where there's 1.5 5 workers per pensioner. We're getting there because the population, thanks to the excellent health system that we have a population with the longest surviving life expectancy in Europe, and that has a cost. At the same time, the main thing at the heart of the desire to reform. Let's not forget that some unions are in favor of such a reform. For example, the biggest union in France, the CFDT, is not backing the strike. The railway workers of the CFDT are backing the strike because the railway workers will lose. That's for sure. They're definite losers and they have a great power of nuisance. For the rest, nobody knows exactly until we see the full outline of the bill. But the unions want to preserve the system also because they manage it. They co-manage it. That's one particularity of the French system, that the social security and pensions are managed, and they also want to balance the book in the long term, not just in 2025, but to make sure that in France we have a system which is where the workers of today finance the pensioners of today. It's not a capitalist system. It's the only way to preserve this system, which is known as répartition, i.e. not based on capitalization.
We have other issues to cover here. Laura, why should people be concerned when the government has been all over the last few months offering some concessions, particularly when it comes to the equilibrium retirement at 64, where you get the full pension and also the minimum amount of pension set at 85% of the minimum wage?
I mean, it's not clear at all what concessions they've made. We still haven't seen what the project actually is, but they did say that the spending would be limited to 14% of the GDP. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but this means, given the fact that we will have more pensioners in the future than we do have today, this means that pensions will be lower. Now, that's a problem. And the previous speaker was saying that we needed basically to find we needed to lower pensions, or we needed to find a solution, and there was not another solution than the current one put on the table by the government. There is a current solution that is never put on the table by the government and by any government previously, which is to find new resources. It's true, there's less workers financing the pension system today than there was in the past. This is true. But then France has never been so rich. Companies have never created so much wealth than they do today. So wealth is there. We just need to take it where it is. And I'm sorry, but it's not possible that companies, shareholders, that the capital still doesn't contribute to this system. They have to contribute to the system. The big companies have to contribute to the system more than they do today. This is where the fair reform would be.
Philippe, others would argue that the biggest problem is that the French themselves are not willing to step out of their comfort zone. They're used to a generous public pension scheme. And for them to try something different, like in different parts of the world where you have private and independent pension schemes, that's where they freak out.
Well, you would have to define first what you call comfort zone. I'm not sure that pensions which are around 1,000 euros or between 1,000 and 1,500 euros a month are really very comfortable pensions. This is really what you need to live. And so really it's again an issue which is about the sort of, it's a civilization issue. Let me use a very strong expression there. And I think the French are also defending that. The fact that after working, over 30 years and hard work, you should really be in a position to enjoy your retirement and do it not in poverty, as it is the case in a number of countries in Europe and in the world, but have benefit from a system in which you can live decently. And I think if you compare the situations in Europe, I think it's very telling. France is a better country in Europe at the moment to retire. If you retire, if you're old, you better be in France rather than, say, in the UK, for instance, where it is much harder. Exactly for that reason, people have set up in the past France after the Second World War, and later on, the unions and workers have defended the system, and for a reason, because in the end, you can enjoy that, and also you don't live in poverty.
Jacques, briefly, please, if you don't mind, what would be the political price Macron will have to pay if he decides to abandon the reform?
I don't think that Macron can afford to abandon the reform, because that would be, as you say, paying a big political price. He was elected to be a reformer, and the French love reforms. They all say, oh yeah, we need to reform the country, until it affects them. And then they don't want to reform anymore. But in that case, he will, I'm sure, make some concessions. He has to, the main concern for him will be the state of the public sector workers, hospital staff, especially teachers, to reassure, to make them, he will make concessions, and they already have announced some compromises. We know that the reform will not affect the police, will be, and the army and the firemen. It's been said that they will be able to leave earlier than the rest.
Okay.
The teachers, they've been told that their pensions will increase because the wages will increase during their career, and not, they will, at the moment teachers have good pensions and lousy wages. With the new proposals made by the government, they will have better wages and equivalent pensions.
Okay.
That's what they will try to do to diffuse the situation, and we'll see the real debate will start when they announce next week, the outline, the precise outline
of the scheme. Okay. Laura, is it early at this stage to tell whether the strike will continue for quite some time, like in 1995, or that the momentum will start to fade away if the government offers more concessions?
It's very unlikely to predict anything regarding the movement. But as I said earlier, I was very, very impressed with the number of people who were in Rouen this morning. And it's been the same in all of the cities in France. I think there were 450 demonstrations in France, and the one in Paris is currently going, and I think it's massive. So I think it's definitely a very strong start for the mobilization, which is showing, well, first of all, how much attached the French people are to their pension system, but also I think this is also, let's say, altogether a resentment that has built up against this government, which is clearly not understanding the level of social inequalities in France, the level of discontent with these policies, with the policies that the government, the so-called reforms that the government is pushing forward, which always produce more precariousness for the people who are already precarious, and which continues to reinforce or to increase the income of the wealthiest of the population. I think the government really hasn't understood the extent
of the anger on the streets
with their policies at the moment. So this is also playing a role. This will also play a role in the continuity of the movement or not.
Philippe, when you see the anger on the streets, and if Edouard Philippe, the Prime Minister, finds himself in the same position that forced Alain Juppé in 1995 to abandon the pension scheme, could it be an indication that Macron may not be able to secure a second term as president?
It could be a turning point, because I'm quite happy you mentioned the 1995 precedent, because then, under the Jacques Chirac presidency, the then Prime Minister Alain Juppé tried exactly an overhaul of the pension system. It completely backfired. It started off in the public sector, but then spread over. And even by proxy, a lot of people couldn't afford or couldn't dare, if you like, to go on strike, did support the strike. Eventually, Chirac had to withdraw the plan, dissolve the National Assembly, and call for an early election. It's completely backfired, because it brought the socialists, the left, to power, and he lost that election. So we're not there yet, it's early day, but I think, yes, it shows two things: how sensitive any reform to the pension system is in France, and rightly so. It's so important, we discussed that. And also that Macron doing that at the moment, at a time where he's quite unpopular, he's done already a number of unpopular reforms, and also surfing on the wave of the Yellow Vest movement, lots of protests going on in France. I think, yes, it could backfire again. And then if it were the case, that would seriously weaken Macron.
Philippe, Marliere, Laura Slimani, Jack Rond, I enjoyed talking to you about this particular issue, which is turning to be a thorny topic for President Emmanuel Macron. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.